He had to pay them double time for the seventh. This law is still on the books. Now, Roosevelt gave up on the poor and began turning his attention to foreign affairs. It is believed by some that he was trying to become a dictator, copying the dictators of Europe, and Europe had several dictators, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Everybody be back in about, let's see, be back by 1:30. Yeah, 1:30. All right. One theme that I had from the last chapter I wanted you to get was that government action did not end the Depression. On this one, the thing that really started World War II, and it started many wars, is pacifism. If the bad guys really think that you're not going to fight, they're going to make war. Now, at the end of World War I, persons who studied war said that, well, it takes two to make a quarrel. Folk, that's one of those old saying, don't believe. Sometimes all it takes is one person forcing the other side into the conflict. Believe me, this can happen. Now, but they also began to believe that if one side would not make war, then there'd be no war. And men who preached this, men like Albert Einstein, who had made fame as a physicist, wrote a book, Why War? He was a strong pacifist. The nations of the world met together and made a pact to outlaw war called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. There was no means to enforce it. But they actually tried to, but that's not in your book, but they tried to outlaw war. Jewish rabbis taught pacifism. Today they don't. What happened? A bunch of them were thrown alive into screaming into hot ovens. And guess what? They're cured of their pacifism. This is what people will do to you, folk, if you don't stand up for yourself and fight. I see at least one head nodding. People will push you around and kick you around like everything. You've got to stand up for yourself, or people will take advantage of you in every way, shape, or form. But the best way to start a war, be pacifist. And Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi in India, preached passive resistance. We'll talk about that later. But he started his messaging at this time. And with the whole world in a mood for, let's just make sure we never have another war, into this scenario stepped men like Hitler and Mussolini, and we had another war, a big one. The League of Nations, we're going to find out, did very little as the aggressors invaded other countries. Japan invaded China. Italy invaded Ethiopia. And Hitler invaded Austria, Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland and the Rhineland, and nobody went to war. They write letters of protest. Anyway, all this led to wars. Your book starts off with a vignette about Paul Tibbets. Paul Tibbets got in an airplane at the age of 12. Now, keep in mind in those days, very few people got to see an airplane. The airplanes were for the rich to fly in. There were no big major airports, so there might have been a few, but nothing like the airports of today. Flying was highly expensive, and most young men who served in World War II and finally got to put in bombers and fighter planes had never seen the inside of an airplane before the war began. Folks, there was a time when if you were sitting in a classroom and you had to have your windows open on a hot day, there was no air conditioning, you were sitting and you heard an airplane bow overhead, the whole class would stop and everybody would jump, and even people at the student run out the door to take a look, and they'd go home and say, we saw an airplane today. Yes. Today, who bothers to look up? I hope nobody pays attention to them anymore. But in those days, I mean, you know. But anyway, Paul Tibbets later became famous because he helped drop the 2 atomic bombs that ended World War II. We'll talk more about that probably next class. But Britain and France and United States, three countries, sought to avoid war at almost any cost. And Germany and Japan and Italy felt humiliated. You might say, well, wasn't Japan on the winning side after World War I? Yes, but it was a peace treaty that hurt Japan. Japan was treated like a little nation and told they could only have a ratio of 3 ships to 5 for Britain, and France and the United States should have 5, and they only 3, and hey, we're being treated like little people. And they felt more humiliated by the peace than they did the war. Anyway, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations and invaded Manchuria. The League of Nations wrote a letter of protest to Japan and did nothing more. That was the end of it. Now today, at least, we try to put economic sanctions, but the League didn't even go that far. We have most favored nation status for most countries, favored nation, and today we take that away, but in those days, we didn't even have that as a weapon. So Japan started out by invading China, or Manchuria, part of China. And nothing was done. In the meantime, now, something else was going on. The Soviet Union became the Soviet Union in 1917 when the communists took over. The United States for many years would not recognize the Soviet Union. But finally, because a lot of Americans wanted us to, they said, well, the communists have it, the Bolsheviks have it, let's recognize them. So Roosevelt finally recognized the Soviet Union. Very important, because you may know, maybe you don't, the Soviet Union fought on our side in World War II. Now, when I was in high school and I first read that, I had to look, because the Soviet Union had always been our enemy up during my lifetime. Yep, it's there. The Soviet Union actually was on our side in World War II. I'll tell you how they got that way in a little bit. But the United States recognized the Soviet Union. In the meantime, Adolf Hitler began to rearm Germany, contrary to the Geneva Convention. Great Britain, France, the United States did absolutely nothing about it. In the Western Hemisphere, all right, Roosevelt adopted a good neighbor policy toward Latin American countries. Good thing perhaps he did. Now here's the story. You may know that we've talked about how the president, beginning with Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, created a lot of antagonism south of the border. But Harding and Coolidge tried to placate that. Then Roosevelt actually officially adopted a good neighbor policy where he tried to be a good neighbor. Now, what Wilson did not recognize, folks, now this is controversial. These Latin American countries at that time were not ready for a democracy and would not be for a long time. Now that does not say they're not ready now in 2019. Even though I will say this, in a lot of Latin American countries, the gangs have taken over and they control to the point where that a person in the United States is sending $80 a week to his relatives in Central America, and that person has to give 20 of it every week to the gangs around him just to stay alive. So I'm not sure that they're still ready for democracy. We were discussing in high school. I had a high school teacher named Woods, and he said that these countries are not ready for democracy. Well, Woodrow Wilson did not realize that, but the United States would try to impose democracy. But finally, Franklin Roosevelt allowed the dictators to take over and said there's more stability and more peace when they have a dictator. Let the dictator govern. Now this was to backfire on us later when the Soviet Union took over Eastern Europe, and they said to us, you allow dictators in your hemisphere, we're going to have dictatorships, our dictators in ours. But anyway, Roosevelt allowed the dictatorships to be in their country, for better or for worse. He also had these countries, he set up to control them. He began the policy of economic control, where that he controlled the tariffs in such a way that the good nations, the nations that lined up the best with us, even if they were dictatorships, those nations he would charge one tariff to, and then the nations who didn't like us or he didn't like, he'd charge a higher tariff to. all in an attempt to get these nations to see things our way. So he used tariffs to get these nations to trade in a way that favored the United States. Now, a lot of people say it was a good thing that Roosevelt got Latin America on his side, because when the war broke out, we did not have to fight our own hemisphere. The Latin American countries, they'll brag, I mean, I had this Latin Americans do a paper, they'll brag that we helped fight the Germans. Yes, they did. When the war was obviously over and the Germans were thoroughly, pretty well defeated, all the Latin American nations piled on and declared war on Germany. But they did side with us. But they remained neutral until they saw which side was going to win. Then they more or less just piled on. Now, some Latin Americans, particularly Brazil, declared war earlier than some of the others. Brazil did a lot to help the Allies. Argentina and Chile, yeah, they declared war on Germany very, very late in the war. But anyway, oh yes, a lot of the Nazis fled to Latin America when the war was over, including Adolf Eichmann. Did anybody see the movie about Eichmann that came out a couple months back? I did. But anyway, you did? Oh, okay. Yeah, there was a movie that came out about Eichmann a couple months back. But anyway, he fled to, and the rumor is Adolf Hitler fled there also. And the United States